Okay, so I want to set up the first slide that you're going to see. So I'm a big fan of the science fiction writer, pioneering Black science fiction writer, Octavia Butler. And when I was in, undergrad at college in New York, I was in the university library, and I pulled her book down, science fiction book, and I looked on the cover, and there was, a Black person on the cover of the book. And that's the first time I saw a science fiction book with a Black person on the cover. So I just read the blurb and I immediately bought it, because this was just the first time. I was a big science fiction fan. So seeing a book, where the central character was going to be a Black person, it was a new experience for me. And so this book, she talks about an alien race that comes to Earth after a nuclear war has happened. So there aren't a lot of human beings left, but there are some left. And they collect the few human survivors that are left and bring them on board their ship. And the quote you're going to see on the next slide is what one of the aliens said to one of the humans about, why they had this war, why they had these problems, and what this is what they've observed about human beings. Now, I found the quote, very useful because as I was studying evolutionary behavior science, it was clear to me that Octavia Butler must have studied some evolution herself, because I've read all her books. I have all her books, I read them over and over again. And she was just spot on in the description of human beings that she had. So let's take a look at her quote, take a moment and give it a read. That's a picture of Octavia up there, favorite author. So she talked about human beings being hierarchical. Obviously, she's saying this through, the alien character. And Octavia Butler grew up in, Jim Crow, segregation America. So prejudice and discrimination and hierarchical behavior, all of that, it's a theme throughout her work. Misogyny, patriarchy, things like that. They're a big theme in her work. If you haven't heard of her, trust me, you'll love her work. But this quote right here really got me, because it's actually one of the biggest problems we have. I know I talked about it, I think, in the first lecture, this tribal psychology we have, and always in competition with each other, trying to be on top, trying to outcompete others and control and so forth. So what she was saying is this hierarchical behavior is what caused us to actually destroy ourselves, because, we took pride in it. We loved it, we supported it, we didn't act like it was a problem. It was such a huge problem, and ignoring it was like ignoring cancer. And she's really correct. It's like we didn't know what we were doing. It's caused so much problems in the world today, and it's going to cause a big problem in the future. Right here. When I was in grad school, I had to do a presentation on dominance behavior in humans. And part of the presentation was, well, where is this dominance behavior in humans going to take us? Now, all of you have heard of artificial intelligence before, and we're very close now to, making this happen. This is probably something that's going to happen in the next 15 to 25, 30 years. Now, there are two forms of artificial intelligence. You're going to have general artificial intelligence, which is like a human level intelligence. But because, technology can evolve much, much faster than biology can, general intelligence will then go to artificial superintelligence very quickly, probably in a number of years. Now, there's obviously a big problem with this, because we'll be creating basically a new species that is more intelligent than us, a lot more intelligent. But yet we think it's going to serve us, which kind of doesn't make sense. Because once you have, a sentient being, it's going to have its own goals and objectives, its own drives and motivations. And for perspective, it's like, being a brilliant university professor who's going to let a 2-year-old tell him what to do and only do what the 2-year-old tells him what to do. Now, that's not smart. That's not going to happen. But a lot of people in the field think that's exactly what's going to happen. Now, what it is they're tempted by what artificial superintelligence will be able to do. It's going to be much more intelligent than us, so it'll be able to solve a lot of our problems, give us a lot of things we want, all these rewards. But as you can see right here, tribal competition means that the development is inevitable, even though there's a lot of danger involved in creating it. But because corporations and nation states are all competitors, they can't afford for their competitor to get it first. So even though we recognize the problem, everyone has to go ahead and try and get it, because if you don't get it, the first people to get it are going to end up controlling and dominating you. So this is kind of how human beings work against themselves. And we're also seeing that with the issues around climate change. Because of the competitiveness, we can't just cooperate as a species to deal with a problem that isn't going to recognize borders or anything else. So this hierarchical behavior is taking us down the road to where this will be a problem. I don't know, if you're like my age, I'm 52, I'll probably be on my way out when this becomes a big time threat. But if you're a young person, you're probably going to live to see this. And we have no idea what's going to happen. We just know there may be great reward, maybe great problems, but this hierarchical behavior, tribal hierarchical behavior, huge problem. And that relates to what we're going to talk about today. Because we see this fascist tendencies coming out again in Western democracies. And the political leaders, they understand these fears people have. And this is why we get people like this and a lot more all throughout Western civilization now, whether they're close to power or in power or something like that. You have all these types of political parties displaying these kind of tendencies, where they understand how some groups are feeling, and they're doing exactly what Butler said. We're being hierarchical, we're taking pride in it, we're pursuing it, we're not recognizing the danger of it, and where it's possibly taking us as a civilization, or certainly in Western civilization, but it's happening in some other places as well. So if we start off with democracy, it's increasingly looked like democracy is ill-suited to function well in multi-ethnic and multiracial societies. And this is because of the conditions when it first arose. They weren't really multi-ethnic, multiracial. They were quite different from what the conditions are now. There were no significant, racial groups present in many of these countries when they first got democracy. And even if they were, they were racial groups that didn't have any power. They were at the bottom of racial hierarchies, no political influence or power when they came into being. It was basically a white man's show. Obviously, even white women weren't voting then, but pretty much it was just about white men, voting. So they had complete control. And that's not the case anymore. A lot of people can vote now, women and minorities and so on. So from an evolutionary perspective, the democracies, they're now mismatched with the environments they were selected to operate in. Because as you have this shrinking demographic and growing minority populations, these minority populations are now gaining, some political power. So these conditions that democracies have to operate in changed from monoracial to multiracial one. So the political power is being shared up. There are a lot of values and challenges that are changing society in ways that, years ago they never thought would happen. Now, the big deal about this is if, you're this majority white population and you're democratic as well, but now you look at your fertility rates shrinking and the minority population is growing, it's obvious what happens at the end of that road. And now that they're starting to see visible signs of it, they're getting worried. So these Western democracies are increasingly defined by racial and ethnic factions, as opposed to the traditional economic policy differences. And this is creating this instability we're seeing now politically, people being less interested, less excited about democracy. Certainly large chunks of these white populations are not so excited about democracy anymore because it's not really doing what they want it to do. And as they look down the road, they're seeing it's going to be increasingly weakened in them being able to get their way. So this is when fascist tendencies become more attractive if you want to maintain your power. So this is a book by Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State in the United States. She published this about 2 years ago, 2018, maybe 3 years ago. And it talks all about the fascist tendencies developing throughout Western civilization, certainly in Europe and in the United States. So I want to start with economic insecurity, because this is a big part of it, because when the money is flowing, then people are less worried. But when you get some economic problems, people get a bit more, tight. Their attitudes and the competitiveness starts to develop between groups. So Western economies have not been growing as much as they did in the 50s through to the 80s. These were like boom years, or all throughout the West. But economic inequality has grown now since that time. So if we take a look at this graph, you're looking at all these developed nations, and it's like a measure of health and social problems, an index of it, and the levels of inequality in these nations. And as you can, this is like 10 years old. This was from the book, The Spirit Level, where they studied a lot about inequality and talked about all the problems it causes in a country and a society. You see the UK is right up there near the top, and right at the top, really in a very bad place, is the country with the biggest economy, most powerful nation on the earth, but huge levels of inequality. So you shouldn't be surprised with the amount of violence and social problems that you see over there, because when you have these very high levels of inequality, especially in these developed nations where people think they shouldn't be living that way, you're going to have those kinds of problems. If you look down at the bottom there, you'll see a lot of these nations that are much more peaceful, have a lot less of these types of social and cultural problems. Japan, a country I lived in for many years, very, very peaceful, safe society. There are other reasons for that also, but there's a lot less inequality there, and you see a lot of the Nordic nations there as well. Now, where the UK and the United States are, that's not going to change. I think it will get worse, as we'll see later on why it may get worse. So the growth of inequality, now combined with less economic prosperity, it's really a very bad combination for any society, but now in a multiracial one, where people are challenging the racial hierarchy in many different ways, it becomes more toxic, possibly volatile. And you're seeing all of that taking place in America right now. Don't expect any of that to calm down. It's just going to get worse. So British people born in the 1980s have 20% lower household incomes compared to the generation before them, while house prices and inequality have soared. And in America, 90% of Americans born in 1940 earned more than their parents, but only 50% of Americans born in 1980 are doing that. And a lot of white people see this as evidence they're not making the progress and achieving the way prior generations did. So they're feeling the effects of inequality, not to the extent the Black community is, but we're used to it. A lot of them are not, and they're getting bent out of shape about it. So the scarcity of resources resulting from this economic waning, and also this feeling that being white is being devalued now because it's being challenged in all these ways, talking about white privilege and all the things going on with sexual identities as well, race, patriarchy, and so on. It's being challenged in so many different ways, and a lot of them are feeling that they're under a lot of pressure now. It's just not nice and smooth and everyone knowing their place with whites at the top as it was before. All of that is being challenged. And these are really nurturing conditions for racial prejudice and these status conflicts to grow. So the politicians know this. They know that, a lot of the white population are feeling this way. So they are tapping these concerns that they have. So they're blaming these groups of people, the globalist elites, minorities, the immigrants, so they're pushing the xenophobia and, China's taking all the jobs and all this kind of stuff because they want to, get in office. They want power and they understand the fears that this population of white people have. So they tell them all these things as in, I'm the guy that can fix all of that. So if you give me a vote, I'll get in there and I can fix it. So do we have any questions so far?
Yeah, thank you, Christopher, for that introduction. As I said at the beginning, we're going to stop in at the end of each segment and have a quick roundup of questions. So we've got a few minutes, maybe 5 to 10 minutes for this section. And before I ask my own question, I'm going to ask anyone who wants to raise their virtual hand and talk to Chris directly. Feel free to do so now. If not, please post in the chat and I'm happy to read it out for you. Yeah, so Marcus has a question, which is quite similar to my question. Can politicians change anything then? Because I think there's a lot of gloom in what you were saying, Chris, especially if we consider hierarchies are natural. That means even abolishing hierarchies is just, I guess, futile. And what then do we do with the notion of democracy? Is that a fallacy? Is that something that we should be or shouldn't be fighting for? So I'll tag those 2 points in with Marcus's questions and wait for the next ones.
Well, politicians can certainly change things. It gets difficult when they're obviously most politicians are just very much self-interested, right? They're trying to win, their political seats, or they're trying to keep it. So when they know these fears and these feelings are out there, then they want to try to use that to get what they want for themselves. This is what you saw brilliantly done by Donald Trump. So he understood to play the white racial resentment, issue up and speak in a way that the base he wants would appreciate him speaking in. So he didn't speak like a lot of the politicians before. He spoke like he was in a bar. He just said exactly what his base, his group of people really wanted to hear. And this is the kind of politician you don't want because he's now just playing off the fear to get what he wants. He's a textbook, case of someone with narcissistic personality disorder, textbook. A lot of people in psychology know this. And actually, a group of them wrote 2 books on how he's just a textbook case of that and how dangerous it was to give him this kind of power. Now, sometimes you do get politicians who want to do the right thing, but sometimes it's going to mean that they have to go against, if not the majority, certainly a large segment of their population. Because sometimes the mob can want the wrong thing. And obviously the mob that people here and in France and Germany and in the United States wanted is they wanted continued white social domination. So the politicians who kind of, implicitly talk about that, they dress up the words a little bit, but they know who they're talking to. And, they know what, they're telling people that put me in there and I'm going to keep white people on top. And because they still are the majority in these countries, you can do what Trump did. You can get in power. So theoretically, of course, politicians can change things. You do have some good politicians, but sometimes in let's say a democratic country could be dangerous because let's say Obama got in there in his first term and they really wanted to do everything that was right that he's supposed to do, as opposed to be worried about the fears that people had. Because since he's left the presidency, he's talked about, well, I couldn't push the reparations thing because white people would be upset. Or I couldn't do this because white people would be upset. And he knew he couldn't win a second term and he'd be out of there. Probably some people in his own party would turn on him. So when it comes to, democracy, in a way, the mob has a lot of rule. Now, if the mob wants something bad, they can get it, because there'll be a politician who's willing to follow them. And if they're the majority, then they can go in. So democracy does work, but, there are problems with it now, especially in these multi-ethnic, multiracial societies, because as I shown in the quote earlier, it's
Mm.
less about economic policy and more about, I want my tribe to beat yours.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I would take issue with the statement that democracy works, because what I see, and you can contrast and compare Trump and Obama, what I see actually is a systemic oppression whereby true representative democracy, democracy in the truest sense of the word, does not really happen, because we might vote for politicians to represent us and make decisions, but actually the decisions they make on our behalf are not ones that we're invested in at all, actually. So for me, there's no real democratic system. And I'd perhaps also contrast that with China as well, which is highly centralized and maybe has more of a socialist communist center, even though it uses capitalist means to execute its plan for domination. So those are two really interesting case studies, which don't fill me with hope, I've got to say. And that leads on to a question from Tata, which is, why don't we just leave? What are the factors that prevent Blacks and Africans in any continent outside Africa from going back to the continent where we can probably find refuge a lot easier?
Well, I'd like to take up your point first before I move on to that question, in that you're right. First of all, obviously, there's a lot of corruption out there. There's lots of corporations and other people who have influence over democratically elected people so that they make decisions, in their interest. Like, I don't know if I said it in one of the earlier lectures. So it was with the DNA database, right? So we found out about, 11, 12 years ago that they collected the DNA of every Black person in the country. But more importantly, that they violated the Data Protection Act in allowing the big pharmaceutical companies access to the DNA database. Now, this is obviously because they hustled, they paid politicians
right
to get access to the DNA database. So now, the GlaxoSmithKline, the Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, they've got more Black DNA than any African country in the world, doing all kinds of research they want on it, and I'm not going to get any money, I didn't get arrested, but someone in my family, they took the DNA from my niece when she was 16. She had a fight coming home from secondary school, and police showed up, stopped the fight, didn't arrest anyone, but took her DNA. Now, when they take the DNA of anyone in your family down to like the third or fourth cousin, they get the DNA of the entire family. So this is how mathematically they're shown that because they had taken the DNA of like 80% of the young Black men in the country, that covered the entire Black population. So, and now they've handed that information over to these big pharmaceutical companies, and now they're using it to make their money. So that's how democracy was perverted, because they violated their own laws. But also, you're right about China. We know from the research that Chinese people respond better to authoritarianism than they do to democracy. When they have democracy or anything like it, China is a mess. China is just a bunch of warring states and warlords and all kinds of, chaos in the country. Because they are culturally different people, psychologically different, they operate best under central authoritarian rule. All the successful periods in Chinese history, authoritarian rule, centralized rule. And this is why right now they are in the most successful period in their entire history, is right now. Under this government, we're told is so terrible and evil and so on. They've got more wealth as a people than they've ever had. And not, just at the top. It's trickled that they've brought more people out of poverty than any other nation in human history. So how bad can that government be? And one more example, Japan, they're democratic, but they've had the same party in power since like the 1960s. They were only out of power for like 4 years. Same thing in Singapore, same party in power, democratically elected since 1959. So we do have a lot of variation in how it operates, but this is based on the people, on their informal institutions, their social norms, and so forth. So you're really good. You can't just say democracy, great, and give it to everyone. It's not going to work like that. You have to look at the people first and see what works well and matches with them. Now, the question, what was the second question again?
About repatriation.
Right. Well, because of our evolved tendencies, that's just not going to work until the standard of living in those nations changes. This is one of the primary things about human beings. They're going to go where the things that they can satisfy as an individual, as a family, are good. So medical care, housing, employment, satisfying the basic primary needs that you have. It's better in the countries that are more wealthy. There's more opportunity there. There's better healthcare. And humans are always going to go to those places. I mean, even now, with as bad as things as people are saying in China, look at the amount of people from all over the world who are actually moving to China. There's a large African population in China. There are people from America and the West move to China, living there. So, and supposedly as oppressive as they are, why is that happening? Because the standard of living now in China has really gone up. So if you got the opportunity, people go. So we're not going to go to countries that are really poor, where as a family, the opportunity isn't there, the healthcare isn't there, and so on. That's just not going to happen. We can go all the way back to ancient Egypt. Once there was a great society, people migrated in from everywhere. You see, it started out all black, and then white folks started moving in it because it was all good there. So all throughout human history, you see these societies that are well off, they're going to attract people.
Well, you know what? You seem to be saying that centralized authoritarian rule, where you accept natural hierarchies, is the best way for human progress and social progress. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's what I'm learning. And it relates here to a question that we've got from Anushe, which is, are you saying that the authoritative rule in China is the reason for removing many from poverty? So income inequality, since the CPP, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, came into power, what's the data saying on that? And this will be the last question before we move on. Sorry, I couldn't take any more, but I think it's a good one to close with.
Yeah, I think I want to generalize my answer to that, because then I think you'll understand it, because I'm not saying their way of governing is for everyone. I'm saying the research shows that the Chinese population cooperate better when they are under authoritative rule. Now, if you want your nation to work, you need trust, you need cooperation, you need efficiency. Now, they have that culturally. And once they had this government that decided we're not going to centrally plan the economy the way we do, they haven't freed it up completely, but they certainly freed it up for them to start making the money and then spreading that money around. And now we've seen economic growth. You've lifted 500 million people out of poverty, like it's never been done before. They are graduating 4 times the amount of STEM graduates than the United States. They are very high up there in research and development. They've taken literacy rates, like from when they first came in, it was maybe like 10, 20%. Now it's way over 90%. Most of their population was living on like $2 a day. Now like 99 out, no, I think it was 97 out of 100. Only 2 or 3 out of 100 are living on that. All of this happened under CCP. Now, if you were someone who had the economy the size of Ghana in 1960, and now you have this economy that's challenging the United States, and they're not even operating at half the productive capacity of the United States yet. So if they crank it up to like half what the United States is doing productively, their economy will be 4 times bigger than the United States. So you have to look at the level of cooperation it takes to do that. Now, the research shows they respond better to authoritarianism. So for China, yes, that is the right plan. I'm not saying the government's perfect. None is. I mean, when America was running around talking about how democratic and civil and just they are, they still had Jim Crow. So you could say what you want, but be doing something completely different. So there's certainly some things the Chinese government should be cleaning up. But in terms of the responsibility for the economic boom and putting their country in a position where they can't be bossed around by the West anymore, it's absolutely due to the decisions that the government has made. They can focus on a long-term policy. Let's say we're going to do this 25-year plan and do it. You can't do that here. You can't do that in America, because the politicians are in and out every 6, 8, 10 years, and they tear everything up and give people some new plan that's from me. Whereas in China, they can say in 1980, okay, here's what we're going to do, and 30 years from now, this is the target we're going to reach. And they can do it and have been doing it. So you can't argue with the success. It's right there for anyone to see.
Well, the question is, and I hope you'll address this in part 2 or 3, is what's best for Africa and Africans? And really, really would love to dive deeper on that because I have
Yeah. There's a
some
section in the book on that, but the truth is it deserves much more than a section. It needs
right.
an actual book to do
Right.
that. And I know we've had these discussions throughout the year about the institutions and African people. So yes, that's a great question. And I'll just give you a little bit here, take 30 seconds. So one of the major problems there is that through what we've talked about in prior lectures, the prestige, success psychology that we have, they've been copying European institutions, but they don't work very effectively, massive levels of corruption and so forth. But that is going to happen because you're taking something not made for you and applying it to people culturally and psychologically very different. It doesn't fit with African social norms. It doesn't fit with their cultural history and the informal institutions they already had. What Africa should have done, and to be honest, in the 19th century, they were doing it. It's the 20th century ones who were educated in the West, Paris and London and all these places, come back to Africa and they want to bring all this stuff they brought back from the West. Whereas the 19th century leaders, they said, okay, we'll take some of the nice things you're doing in Europe, but we will keep our own institutions. We will keep our own systems of government. We will just move these forward and modernize them and continue to develop them. Now, why this is important is because institutions grow out of your cultural history, your social norms, and your psychological ways. So when you take someone's institution from the other side of the planet and put it down on top of this psychologically and culturally very different people, the least you're going to get is going to operate very differently, but quite often it's terrible. So it's like democracy in Afghanistan. How's that going? Terrible, catastrophic, and they'll be back with the Taliban before the year is out. But very different people. So this is Africa's major problem. As I'm sure a lot of you have already studied African systems of government, so you know you had stable governance that lasted for hundreds of years. You're supposed to bring that forward the same way Europeans did, but we didn't do that. They've got European institutions on top of African people, never going to work.
Well, thank you for that, Chris. I mean, that was more than 30 seconds. But
Yeah, sorry. I get excited, you know.
no, but you're taking us down the route of, an African personality and African ontology and those kind of questions. I think they do deserve their own lecture, actually. So we'll bring you back for that. I'll remember. But please continue part 2 because we want to get through the content that you've got today.
Okay. So let's see. Let's go back. Okay, part 2. So the authoritarian mindset. Now, a lot of work has been done around this mindset, and I'm using Jonathan Haidt. He's a social psychologist, and he does a lot of work around political and moral psychology. He's like one of the world leaders in this. So he calls these people of the authoritarian mindset people who are not necessarily racist, but have a strong sense of moral order. And when they perceive things are coming apart and there's a decrease in that moral order, then they start to become racist and hostile to alien groups, Blacks, gay people, Mexicans, trans community, just anyone they consider not part of the traditional order. And that this is a quote from him. This is the core audience that Trump has spoken to. But I wanted to take a point to point out this calling Black Americans an alien group. He wasn't being rude. That the research will support him that they are perceived as some type of alien group. Now, after 400 years in America, if you perceive Black Americans as an alien group, then I think that's something we in England need to pay attention to because we haven't been here 400 years as a large group of people. And if they're in America for 400 years and they're still an alien group, well, we're always going to be an alien group here. So this is something for us to keep in mind. So as multiculturalism is emphasized more and more, there's a pushback on it. Certainly from these people of the authoritarian mindset and conservative people on the right, they are really triggered by this. And as you know, by now there's been massive pushback against it. So people who score low on measures of authoritarianism, they don't let all this talk, all the xenophobic talk, the racism, the sexism, and all this stuff, they don't let the changes in the traditional order bother them. It's the people who are high on this authority. And some of these people are Black, by the way. It's not just, white people. I'm sure you know some people like that, some Asians and Black people who support these white people who have the authoritarian mindset. Now, people high on measures of authoritarianism, they get scared. And that's when the Nigel Farages and, Trumps and these kind of people, they become attractive to them. They like people, these bully type leaders with these fascist tendencies. When the traditional order is going, people of this mindset, these are the people we have to worry about because they are not big fans of us. They only like Black people in a proper place at the bottom under control. So they become very supportive of government use of force, to beat down, whatever threats to their status and the old accepted standards. And they found politicians to vote for. Now you heard a lot of talk about far-right populists, but in my opinion, that's misleading. And for a lot of people, it's misleading. They know that these guys are far-right, white ethno-nationalists. And they are big fans of books like this. So over the past 15, 20 years, maybe every 2 years, you'll see a book come out talking about, the West is dying and death of the West and, the fertility rates and all these migrants, different people coming in and they're changing the culture and what's going to happen to us and so on. And these books are all bestsellers. Douglas Murray is right here in England with this book he wrote, and he's written another one since then. But they all have the same theme, that they talk about the shrinking white population, the immigrants and migrants coming from Asia and from Africa and Muslims and Latinos and even East Asians, if you're talking about Canada. But these books now, the theme, the feelings they have, it's becoming a part of culture. So people are starting to have the same fears that people in these books have, but they don't read the books. They're just listening to each other, social media, listen to politicians and so forth. And it's becoming something you can now see in the culture. These fears are very, very real. So a situation where a population is, numerically, in the majority, and they've been perceiving themselves as dominant and superior, for the past several hundred years. And now they're looking at signs that these positions are under threat, that they might change. So it produces these feelings of anxiety in them. So I know I promised past few lectures that we're going to get into the scientific evidence of this, because you shouldn't just listen to me and think, yeah, he's saying, no, we're going to get into the empirical evidence. The past 15 years, there's been a whole lot of studies that show over and over and over and over again how white people are feeling about demographic change across Western civilization. So we're going to take a look at about 4 or 5 studies and their conclusions. So this one is really interesting. It's one of my favorites because this is just 11 years old, and already the things it predicted, they're already happening right now. Now, what happened in this study is they took some Latino people and strategically, placed them in some communities I think it was in Massachusetts, in like a local community. So you'll be seeing them when you go to the supermarket, when you go to the train station, your bus stop, these different places. You're just seeing more people who don't look like you, more Latino people. And then they tested the community some weeks after they placed these people there. And what they found is that, and these people were more the community was known for being liberal and progressive. So we're not talking about the Republicans and the people on the right, actually. Supposedly these are like the white liberal democratic people. And they found that people got very concerned and started to change their attitudes and even their political leanings just from seeing more Latino people, this change in the community. So they concluded that, intergroup threat can be stimulated by even very minor demographic change, leaving, this big possibility that demographic change in Western nations and in homogeneous states, so they're talking about places like Iowa, Wyoming, Nebraska, these places that are much more white than the coasts or the American South, that it will be accompanied by intergroup hostility. And of course, the past few years, you've already been seeing that in America, and we're having things here as well, in France, and even a bit in Germany as well. We're already seeing it beginning, although you'll see it much more in America, because America demographically are pretty much way ahead of where Europe is in terms of demographic change, because Americans are looking at white people being less than 50% of the population, maybe 25 years from now. So there is some point in the 2040s, they're going to be like 40 something percent, less than 50% of the population. And it's in their face. It's on the news all the time. They're very aware of it, and it's already changing behavior. Now, this one was done in Canada and the United States, and their focus was on East Asians in Canada and Latinos in the United States. So what they did is they brought in two groups of white people in each country to run the experiment. And they would expose one group to demographic data projections showing that whites will be less than 50% of the population before 2050. But then they would not expose the other white group to this data. And then they would test them on how they felt about other groups. So whites who viewed this data displayed more racial resentment and fear of ethnic minorities than the whites who were not exposed to this data. And they also displayed more pro-white solidarity. So think about that for a moment, pro-white solidarity. That's going to be showing up in education, in employment, criminal justice, and so on, in terms of just treating those who don't look like them a little more negatively in how they respond to them, and being a bit more positive and supportive to other white people. So in other words, we're talking about a lot more unconscious bias in how they operate if they have this feeling. And then they replicated the study and found the same conclusions again. So in this study, how increasing diversity racial landscape affects white Americans' racial attitudes, they concluded negative attitudes towards Latinos, Blacks, and Asian Americans, and expressed more pro-white, anti-minority bias. Now, something I forgot to say about this one in 2012, the Canadian one was interesting to me because they were focusing on East Asians. So they're talking about people, Chinese, Korean, things like that. And, they're not stereotyped as being a threat physically or, the usual stereotypes that they face. But some of the discrimination they was faced, it was really just based on that. You are not going to be the minority. These East Asians may be the minority. They're filling up the universities and so on. And they were meeting with the same racial resentment and concerns that, let's say, Latinos were meeting with in America, and certainly not to the level that Black people were meeting with it. But what I found important is that it doesn't matter, what the group was actually doing, because they're not, being involved in a lot of crime or anything like the way other people are stereotyped or other groups. They're just, working, going to school, going to university, opening their businesses and so on. But still, the racial resentment was there. So this is really clear that this is about domination. This is not about fearing how other people are going to change it. This is just about whatever happens, we don't care if you're nice. We want to be the boss as white people, simple as that. And this is one of the more recent ones. So this was done to try to explain, why did all these people who probably wouldn't vote for someone like Trump, 20 years ago, but in 2016, they did. And they found they were studying two different things, not just racism. They also found a status threat, nationally speaking, which we'll talk about in a moment. But this was one of the conclusions of the study, that it's racism that regards minorities as sufficiently powerful to be a threat to the status quo. So this is something I've seen over and over again in the research, that they are okay with minorities as long as we are subordinate to them. The status quo is hierarchy, right? And white's at the top. So when we challenge the status quo, that's when the racism tends to pick up and start to increase. And we are at the beginning of this type of feeling now, because the demographic situation is going to continue. Their population will get smaller and smaller, and the minority groups are going to grow. So this means what is causing them to feel this way is going to intensify and continue to grow. And the attitude is now going to push behaviors that are going to cause more racism to take place, not just politically either. So this is also a quote from that study. So when members of dominant groups experience a sense of threat to their group's position, whether it is the status of Americans in the world at large or the status of white people in a multi-ethnic America, change in people's sense of their group's relative position produces insecurity. And that insecurity produces the fears and the intergroup threat that we saw in the Daniel Hopkins study from 2010. And this matches up with a book I read last year about Has China Won? This was by the former UN Security Council representative. And he concluded American people need to question how much of their reactions to China's rise results from hard-headed rational analysis and how much are a result of deep discomfort with the success of a non-Caucasian civilization. And that is exactly the conclusion that came out of this 2018 study from Mutz, status threat. The status of America in the world is being challenged by China. And this was in the study, they were very specific about who they're feeling challenged by as a nation, and it was China. And then we see this kind of conclusion as well. And I think it's spot on. If this was Germany, you know, growing their economy and challenging America, there would still be some concern because you want to be number one regardless of who the person challenging you is. But if it's a Western nation challenging, this is much more acceptable. But they've had a couple hundred years where no non-white nation has challenged them. And now they're facing this massive challenge from a non-Caucasian civilization, which will cause them to question themselves, because if they see themselves as better than everyone else, because they're white, how can this non-Caucasian nation state be the top nation state on the planet and challenging for that position? They have to question now their feelings about themselves. And this is where you get the anxiety and the instability and the fear reactions you're now seeing to China, because they're about to change the Western perception of self. And here's Nigel's friend, apparently. I think, did you say you met Eric Kaufman, or you might know him?
Not my friend, I rebuke that comment. But we have had him at the center and debated with him, yes.
Right, so he's a good researcher. I like his work.
Yeah.
So this study is really good because this isn't one study. This is a meta-analysis. So there are over 40 studies similar to the studies I've just reviewed with you, and they all are covering the same thing. This response, this negative emotional reaction to ethnic diversity from white people. And it wasn't in just one country. So this is across Western democracies. And here's the conclusion from Kaufman and Goodwin, that large numbers of people across Western democracies feel under threat from immigration and rising ethnic diversity. There's no point shying away from it. And with a meta-analysis, yeah, it's really hard to challenge because we're talking about over 40 studies that are concluding the same thing. And so they stated this evidence is reflected in countless studies and surveys. So not just the 40 that they covered, there's a whole bunch more. And I saw plenty in doing the research for my book. I was really spoiled for choice. This research is everywhere you look for it, and it's happening all across the West. So we can do this in Denmark or Germany or Sweden. You're seeing the same reaction. So this is really about something we talked about in some of the prior lectures about humans having a status sensitivity defense mechanism. And this has most definitely been switched on in white majority democracies across the West now. They're paying a lot of attention to their decline and the growth of people who don't look like them, and the reaction is not good, as we've just seen through a lot of those studies. Now, this is what really they want. They want to go back to a period of not being challenged. Certainly white male dominance, unchallenged white male dominance, and they want protection from us, They don't want to compete for what they have. They want to stay at the top and not be challenged about it. As much as they talk about meritocratic and egalitarian, it's nice when they say it, but when they actually see it starting to change, then they start getting bent out of shape. And you saw those Americans run up and charge the Capitol, because when you really do get challenged and you're being outcompeted, they're not having it. So they're not going to accept, a scenario where they are not central and in charge. They're going to push and they're going to fight it, as is to be expected, because this really is not about being white. Demographic change is threatening to whoever is having their number reduced, whoever is being challenged for the power they have in some domain. This is, the Darwinian expectation. So a good example of that may be in South Africa now. You have Africans from other countries coming into South Africa looking for work. And some of them have been met, with a lot of xenophobia from other, Black Africans, because, obviously they're being challenged for jobs and for the resources in that country by people who they feel should not be there. So this is just a normal, tribal reaction. You're running the show in a land, in a domain, and then other groups come in and they want a slice of the pie. The reaction is going to be negative because you're going to feel they're taking something from you. So any group of humans in this situation that white people are in now, it's quite likely you're going to see this kind of reaction. So a lot of these studies now, the one thing that they are not producing are answers. No one has answers for how to stop this large chunk of white people who feel this way from reacting like this to other people. There's no answers. The only answer they found is you have to make white people feel like they're still going to be socially dominant. That's when they calm down. So this is why, this is Jennifer Richardson. She was the author of one of the studies we just went through. And she says it's terrifying for social scientists because there are no solutions to this. So this is something to think about when we're talking about being all united in how we deal with this. Mm. So these are some of the cues of racial status change that people are starting to see. We have an Asian mayor of London. It hasn't happened before. We now have Kamala Harris as vice president. We already had Obama. And then we had this $1 billion movie with a pretty much all Black cast in Africa. Never happened before. These are cues of racial status change. It's stuff they don't have to research or read or anything. It's right there in their face. That stuff they never used to see before, it's happening now. And a lot of their population, they're not so comfortable with it. It's causing them to feel, particularly white males, and it would be them that the group that feels the most challenged by this, because they've had the top spot, so they have the most to lose of any group. So this is why when you do see that negativity, it primarily will be coming from them. This was it was a really good book scientifically. It's a bit of a boring read. You have to really be into the science to read it, but there was a really lot of good evidence in there. And I took a few quotes from it, but the study at the top was actually her dissertation. So Group Threat and the New Relevance of White Identity for American Politics. So when the dominant status of whites relative to racial and ethnic minorities is secure and unchallenged, white identity remains dormant. So as long as they're bossing it, everything's good. Everyone's in the position they're supposed to be. Now, when they think their group's dominance is threatened or their group is unfairly disadvantaged, and they certainly feel that way, although there's nothing unfair going on, that's when their racial identity becomes salient and you start seeing this white racial resentment and solidarity. So this increase in white unity is normal, because when human tribal senses start tingling, that should be expected. And when circumstances occur that are perceived as challenging or threatening to the goals of their tribe, and as you see here, the goal of their tribe is to remain dominant. And again, it's not about white people. This is just human tribal psychology. You've been bossing it, you want to stay the boss. When that gets challenged, you want to fight to stay there. So they are in the position to feel this the most. So this is why they are the ones having this reaction that is the strongest. However, if we are interested in our future racial welfare, especially considering the social scientists don't have an answer or solutions for this feeling amongst, large chunks of the white population, we got to recognize what's going on here. They're taking an aggressive posture in readiness to make the moves that are going to secure their position in a socially dominant top of the hierarchy place, even as they become a shrinking population. Any questions?
Jeez, where do we start? That was a lot, and my good buddy Tata makes a good point. Frances Cress Welsing, her theories are ringing in my head as you explained, and I think you've just outlined basically the whole idea of white ferocity and how it works and where it's come from. So thank you for that. Let me start by asking if anyone wants to put their virtual hand up before I go to the chat. Just seeing if anyone's brave enough to come off mute.
Speechless.
Got a shy crowd tonight. I like to think that means they're listening intently. All right, Tata, yes, please. Please unmute yourself and your camera if you wish to, and talk to Brother Chris directly.
Yes, hello there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Good. All right then. Could I possibly summarize your part 2 in 3 different words? Power, control, and authority. And that those 3 areas are being challenged on a weekly, daily, and hourly basis.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. He just dropped the mic and ran off.
Well, that's all. I just wanted to ask right there in terms of that power, control, and authority is basically what came to mind right there.
Excellent.
Yeah, no, that's good. That tells me that you're understanding what I'm trying to explain here.
Okay. Thank you.
And now we're going to go to the Black Community Coalition. Hand raise, please unmute.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your findings. I have the impression that the thing you are presenting is like white science in a way. I remember the reference to the chimpanzees. We were asking about what about bonobos, so there is a possibility of a different behavior all the time. So now to make it a necessity that everybody who is the boss has to behave like a predator, capitalist, imperialist person is not convenient if we know there are other possibilities. This sort of shades out actually the possibilities we have and the diversity we also have within human beings and collectives and societies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Christopher, do you want to respond?
Well, it didn't really sound like a question. It sounded like a statement about how he feels. I would say that in some ways he's correct. Look, we're programmed for nice, positive, cooperative behavior, but also for some uncooperative, undermining our rivals and, acting in some very antisocial ways. It's the conditions that tend to bring out one or the other and the nature of the relationships. So certainly within tribes, we do exactly what he said. There's a lot of cooperation, there's a lot of supportive behavior and so on. But we tend not to extend those values across tribal boundaries as much as we do within it. Now, when I've said that, all humans will tend to respond this way when they're in that situation, I I would leave it open to do your own research. You know, have you seen this behavior when you say, look at what was going on in Asia 1,000 years ago in some parts of Asia? Were they behaving this way towards other peoples? I mean, an empire is a hierarchy. What continent do you not see empires on? You know, before, let's say if we looked at the Mesoamerican societies, we saw the Inca, the Aztec, and so on. They were all hierarchies. They were all empires. There was that type of behavior, hierarchical behavior going on. And you're always going to see that because we are hierarchical species. Even the recent evidence we're seeing now of what was going on in Australia, you know, before Europeans got there, there was a whole lot of competition going on there amongst the indigenous people there. And we see one group spreading at the expense of others, and the genes weren't mingling. So when they were spreading, they were kind of eliminating the other groups they were coming into contact with. So yeah, that would be my response to that. I think we have to be careful. Psychological variation is a fact across groups. So when I say there's an African psychology, there's an Asian psychology, that's a fact, but that's a product of the differences in culture in those regions, and then the culture socializing and creating this psychological variation as we move across the planet. But there are patterns to behavior that are pretty consistent.
So let me chime in with this question then. Is from Vaisha. I hope I pronounced that right. Apologies if I haven't. Is it sad Ethiopians and Somalians who are successful in South Africa treat other Africans like slaves and call us Black people? But I think the broader point is your notion of tribal psychology and, you know, the propensity to dominate and create hierarchies seems to justify the fear of white annihilation.
Well, justification is a word we wouldn't want to use, because that we're starting to commit the naturalistic fallacy there when we take an explanation of behavior and move it into the moral realm. So we could call it adaptive, because adaptive is something that helps you, but morally we would say, no, this is wrong. We don't want to go in that. So we're not saying in a moral sense, but we are scientifically explaining the behavior pattern that has, throughout our history as a species, it's been adaptive, meaning we practice this behavior, we get a whole bunch of benefits and advantages from it, and from that we spread.
Yeah, because I look at South Africa and actually my heart bleeds when I see what's happening, particularly to the Nigerian community there. And, you know, I think what you're saying, I worry about us preaching solidarity among Africans and African states. Moving on to two more questions before we go to...
Well, could I add a comment to that though? Wouldn't you say that what's going on there is an example of tribal psychology?
I can find a lot of, I guess, parallels in what you're saying with what's happening there. I just wonder what that does to Pan-Africanism. So
there are ways around it, but you didn't ask for that lecture. So
well, I'm going to go to...
I'll touch on it a bit next week. I'll try to. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to go to Anushe, who says, do you believe that Europeans are in a state of denial psychologically because of their global crimes, or are they fully aware consciously of their fragile position in the world? And I want to tag on to that. If you think the general white population are or aren't, also answer with politicians as well, because I'd love to know the way that they use the psychology to influence their voters.
Yeah, they absolutely are. Many, not all, but a large percentage of them are in denial about who they are, how they got to be in the dominant position they are in, and what their past says about their civilization and their society. So I think the guy who wrote Clash of Civilization, Samuel Huntington, he said it really bluntly. He said, most Europeans feel that they won the world, you know, through their these Enlightenment and Renaissance values and, you know, their cultural ways that are all nice and fluffy and beautiful. And he says, but the rest of the world sees people who practiced organized violence on a level no one else had ever seen. And that's how you won the world, through brutality and genocide and so on and so forth. And that Asians and Africans and Native Americans have no problem seeing that you won the world through organized violence. But Europeans don't see themselves that way at all. But this is also because of our evolved nature, because you don't want to feel bad about yourself, right? You want to say, I'm the best because I do good things. And then, of course, they wrote it down in black and white of how nice and good and better than they are than everyone else. So they do have this collective denial that Shay sort of, absolutely, this is part of the conflict you see today.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so last one before we go to our final question from Shai, which is, I would like to learn more about African governance in the 19th and 20th century. Are there any history books or courses that Chris can recommend?
Yes.
I'm assuming that this relates to institutions.
Right. It's the George Ayeti book.
George Ayeti.
Yeah, Indigenous African Institutions. Do I have it here right now? If I could, I would show it up here. I'll ask my wife to get it. Now, I think it's out of print. So you may have to pay, $40, $50, but if you're really interested in that thing, it's absolutely worthwhile, because he goes to many different African cultures and societies, looks at their systems of governance and their economic activity and so forth. So you don't have to believe a lot of this rubbish we've been taught by the West. You can see the beauty of their systems of governance, how in the ways, the economic activity was not controlled by the chief and the elders. There was free markets, free enterprise, all of that was going on there. Now, what happened is those institutions needed to be brought forward because they were actually very, very successful. So that is a book. It's a really thick book. So it's all in one place, really. It's very worthwhile for you to buy that, because I read that book and then I started to see how those institutions, those indigenous institutions, could have been modernized and brought forward, and those African societies would now work better, because the social norms and the things that the activity amongst people that you take for granted because you're all part of the same culture, these are how the institutions work correctly. When there's a lot of behavior and cultural behaviors that don't have to be taught, that everyone already knows. So an example would be Imihigo in Rwanda. I don't know if I mentioned that before, did I?
No.
Right, so Imihigo was this traditional way that someone in the ethnic group, in the tribe would say, I am going to achieve this goal. They would declare, to the whole tribe, this is a goal that they're going to achieve. And if they don't achieve it, they have shame and disrespect heaped upon them. Now, they've brought this forward, and this is now a modern practice in Rwanda, but they brought it into their institutions in that, so you could be, let's say, the mayor of a city, you could be running a hospital or an education or the community, and you now project, we are going to meet this target in a year or 2 years. And if you don't meet that target, then you do get shame and disrespect for not meeting that target to improve the school, the hospital, the community, the city. But if you meet it, then, Paul Kagame, I think he's the leader there now, right? There's a ceremony each year where everyone who's met this objective, the Imihigo, is brought in front of the nation on television, and they're rewarded. So this is actually really beautiful from an evolutionary perspective, because one, the individual self-interest is being met, because I'm going to get this massive respect and prestige because I declared I'm going to meet this goal and I've met it. But the benefit for the country and the community is massive, because if I now say in my hospital, we are going to meet these healthcare standards, that's benefiting the whole community. If I'm the mayor and I've said what I'm going to do for the entire city and I've met it, then the entire city benefits. So through this cultural practice that even the children know. So this is a social norm that you don't have to educate about. We're not talking about performance contracts here, even though it works like that, because that would be the European perspective. They're taking Imihigo and they're now using it in their institutions to improve all of those institutions and how they operate and serve the country. So the beauty of it is that the individual benefits, so he's self-interested in pursuing it. But when he meets the goal, everyone benefits, improving the society as a whole. And this is a pure African tradition.
Mm.
This is an example of what they're supposed to take and how their institutions are supposed to work with African cultural perspectives and social norms that move from informal institutions into formal institutions and operate effectively because it's something they've been doing for hundreds of years.
Excellent. And I shared the name of the book and a link where you guys can download a PDF copy. I have a PDF copy and I've read sections of the book, and that's where I got it from. Last one with Chi, but listen, I'm going to give you guys 1 minute, in fact, 2 minutes. So 1 minute for the question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm talking too much.
1 minute for your answer, because I'm conscious we want to get through part 4 particularly. So Chi, if you are there.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me? Okay.
We can.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Another really interesting talk this evening. So the first thing that I just wanted to say is that actually I'm Igbo origin, and actually before colonialism, the Igbo tribe were one of the most democratic and horizontal societies in Africa. And it was actually the colonial, British colonialism that kind of broke down those traditions and that kind of political system. So actually, the thing about whether as human beings we naturally are hierarchical, there are examples of societies that are much more cooperative and collaborative. And so, colonialism had a lot to do with that. Like I studied development studies, and I remember like one of my first classes was around the need to impose neoliberal models of development on predominantly cooperative societies to break down the corporation so that people become more individual oriented, so that their needs are met by the market rather than by their communities. So, there's that whole kind of process of socialization. And then also kind of the criminalization or the castigation of societies that try to go in the other direction, which is Cuba. So there's like a massive ongoing embargo on Cuba simply because it chooses to organize its society and its economy in a way that Western hierarchical, individualist, capitalist societies find threatening. So I mean, that's all I'll say, because I don't want to go over time, because there's loads I could say, because it's such a stimulating talk.
Great contribution.
But I just sort of thought I would kind of ask about those perspectives as well. Yeah.
Chris, 1 minute.
1 minute, okay. So we've recommended George Ayeti's book. And he talks about how common what he calls and what a lot of people calls participatory democracy was across hundreds of African ethnic groups. So Chai is correct. We've seen that in many African ethnic groups where there was a form of democracy. You don't hear about it much because Europeans want to act like they invented it. So they don't want to say that. But if you get that book, he'll show you how many societies there was what you would call participatory democracy was common in many African ethnicities.
Thank you.
That's 1 minute, right?
You did great. I'm proud of you. Part 3.
Okay, part 3. So basically everything I just said about a lot of those studies in Europe, in America, it's going on in the United Kingdom and in Europe. It's the same thing. It's across all Western democracies, because as a kid growing up, politics here and in America were very different, but they don't look very different to me now anymore. I see all of them synchronizing, and it's all for the same reason. So here in Europe, there's one of these parties in every Western European and in the Eastern ones as well. I didn't even put Hungary and some of the other ones here, but they're all pretty much the same thing. These far-right white ethno-nationalist parties. And, you go back 20 years, if they existed, they would get like 1 or 2% of the vote. But that's not happening anymore. Like the Sweden Democrats, they were getting like 17, 18, 19% of the vote just a few years ago. So all of this far-right ethno-nationalist swelling and growing and support is happening all across Europe throughout these parties and all these other parties. Greece, all of them have one of these types of parties there, and they've grown significantly in the support that they've received over the past 20 years. Now, if we go to Nigel's friend, Eric Kaufman, he concluded that immigration was the primary political concern, and that fear produced Brexit. And it was just this concern about, white majorities, what's going to happen to them as they shrink. Now, what I find interesting here is that they're always telling us everything is good, that minorities are enjoying all this freedom and everything's the same. But then why are they so worried about becoming a minority themselves if everything is great for minorities? So there's that, denial again that someone mentioned, that they're telling us everything's good because it's to their advantage to tell us that. But when they are faced with becoming a minority, now they're ready to act bad and do bad things and even take themselves back to fascism if that's what's going to keep them in power. But yeah, I certainly would recommend this book. It's filled with all this research, and it doesn't just cover, the United Kingdom, it covers Western civilization in general. So if you want to see a lot more of those studies like what we went before, this is a really good book for you to buy and take your time reading. It's a thick book, so it's going to take you a while, but there's great information here. And again, these are the conclusions the two researchers had, Goodwin and Kaufman, that this is a heightened feeling, and we're going to have this need to minimize that racial threat, because humans are evolved to minimize threat. When something's threatening you, you don't just sit tight, you do something about it. And because the threat level is going to grow, we're going to see an increase in the behavior that is designed to minimize the threat they're feeling from these different sectors. And as Black people, we can never escape that. Whoever it is they're concerned about, if Black people are around, they're going to get it too. There was one study I found really interesting where it was actually just about Latinos, right? And they showed a racist reaction to Latinos, but then also in the study, they found white people were being more racist to Black people, even though Black people had nothing to do with the study. So when they have this racial threat feeling, Black people can never escape that feeling, even if it's another racial group that they're concerned about dealing with. So,
hello, can I please contribute a remark on the subject?
We're not in Q&A at the moment, so I'd ask you if you could hold your question, because after each section we have a small Q&A.
It was not a question, I just wanted to remark.
Okay, yes, save it for then, please. Continue, Chris.
Oh, okay. So scores of millions of white people died in wars in the past due to fascist leaders. And, Black people are not more valuable to white people than liberal democracy is. So if liberal democracy is under threat, and it definitely is, the tendencies, the evidence is all there, then Black people are certainly under threat from the same people who are threatening liberal democracy. So now I'm going to convert it over to social media, which we've touched on, in prior lectures, but it's actually really important with what's going on politically. This is Jonathan Haidt again, the social psychologist I told you, does a lot of work in political and moral psychology. And take a moment to read this quote. So, and here's another quote from Jonathan Haidt. A world in which factions are based on race or ethnicity rather than, economic policy differences, that's the worst possible world. It's the most intractable world we can inhabit, and it's the one that will lead to the ugliest outcome. And that is the world we are in right now. As we saw in the research, people are looking a lot more at racial and ethnic divisions as opposed to differences in economic policy and things like that. Now, stereotypes can increase in their prevalence, and a lot of this now, as we've seen with the footballers and so many other areas, It's happening through social media, through these echo chambers that they get in, all these fears and threats and concerns they have. Of course, it's fueled by a lot of racial stereotypes as well, that they're all sharing in these places where they can get together, where before social media, they couldn't get together, not on this level. So now you can have people getting together across nations, sharing all this information and pushing each other to higher and higher levels of negative emotional reactions to whatever group they've got a problem with. But a lot of this behavior is now actually being reinforced through social media. And again, Jonathan Haidt has done great work around this. And a lot of researchers now are doing work around social media in seeing the problems it's causing on all kinds of levels. If you haven't seen that documentary there in that picture, The Social Dilemma, it's on Netflix. If you have it, I would recommend watching it, because you see the fears and concerns are really, really important, to the point where some people are concerned now about countries moving towards civil war. Certainly in America, a lot of what's gone on there, much of it has been fueled by social media. So social media uses our mental adaptations for sociality and our tribal psychology to influence behavior in ways no one was prepared for. I mean, this is how, the Russians could use social media to create racial division in the United States as a way to weaken the United States. So they would use these bots and people they would set up to constantly talk about racist things towards Blacks and Latinos and so on. And they'd find all this support and draw other Americans into it, weakening the social fabric of the country, which obviously is Russia's goal. But if they can use it that way, so can anybody else. But this is how powerful it is. It's now a national security problem in how social media is used. So because of its ability to access people everywhere at super fast speed, it's like the best medium right now to increase racial tribalism amongst people. And of course, politicians know this. There's no gatekeepers in social media, although eventually this man got himself kicked off social media. But it's not like when you work through newspapers or Fox or CNN or whatever, you can just speak directly to the public, to all your supporters, wherever, whenever you feel like it. And politicians now recognizing this power and are using it to speak to their people with no one interviewing, no one fact checking anything. They can say whatever you want. And this is why this man got so much power that he did. So it's a big, big thing that he's been kicked off. I think it's Twitter. I don't know if he's still on Facebook. I know he got in trouble for that as well. So I'll take a few questions now before we do part 4.
Yes, let's take 3. And we're going to start with the comment that we had while that segment was in progress. I'm not sure who it was from, so if you just want to just chime in.
Hello.
Hi,
Yep.
yes.
Yes, this is my name. I'm in Johannesburg. I'm South African.
Well,
I think the problem is with us, the African people. We betray one another. We love this artificial life, and some actually are the ones, especially those in the leadership position. They are the ones who are betraying the people on the ground, because people on the ground are ready for change, but we still allow our oppressors to continue oppressing us because we are on a competition with them. Instead of us being innovative, if it means that poverty, we have to go back to that poverty. They say Africa is a poor country, and yet we are the richest continent in the world. We have minerals that they don't have, but what's going wrong?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question and contribution. Chris, I'm going to take the other 2 questions or 2 more questions and ask you to answer them in one, okay? So we just do a round. So is there any other questions? Let me see. Anyone wants to put their hand up? No? Okay. All right. So let's just take that one and then jump straight into part 4.
Okay. You said there was 2 questions you want to squeeze into one. Have I heard it already, or?
No. I was just going to get 2 additional questions to tag on to
Okay.
that one, but they didn't come. So
Yeah, I couldn't hear everything Zizi Fo said because it was cutting in and out. I heard something about she was saying Africans are a problem themselves because of who they're listening to. I'm not sure because it was cutting in and out for me, my connection. So I don't know if everyone else heard it clearly, but I don't think I could answer that question clearly because it was cutting in and out a bit on me. I'm sorry.
do you want to clarify? No, I think there's some connectivity issues.
Yeah, I think so. Did you hear it clearly? Because I didn't hear it clearly.
Yeah, so I think the question was maybe around complicity, solidarity, and the leverage of resources. But I was unsure how that was relating to the segment. So
Maybe we could hear it again after the next segment.
yeah,
Maybe it'll be clearer then.
I think she's dropped off as well. So perhaps she'd come back and then we can get the question in part 4. But please, conscious of time, we've only got 20 minutes. And
Okay. Well, this is the last section. So shall I go?
yes, please. Yes.
Okay. So part 4, I want to talk about job loss, automation, robots, and the racial hierarchy. And this is actually really important if it's not something you're already aware of. So technological employment, mass unemployment is coming for all of us. It's already taken a big chunk out of the employment sector with millions of lost jobs already to automation and artificial intelligence in the new millennium. So some of these you're already familiar with. You go to the supermarket and you have self-checkouts now. So this has taken jobs. You come home from Heathrow and you see your passport is now checked by automated software, not a person. That car there without any steering wheel or something already exists and is being tested in America. It's a self-driving car. And that truck made a transnational from East Coast to West Coast in America, across the country to deliver pharmaceutical supplies with no driver. So these changes, some of them are here, some of them are coming very, very shortly, and it's going to cause a lot of unemployment. So let's take a look at a bit of the research on this. So an Oxford study, I think it was in 2017, said that 47% of US workers have a high probability of seeing their jobs automated over the next 20 years. And in the UK, the Oxford study predicted 35% of UK occupations are going to be claimed by the automated software and all this stuff coming out of Silicon Valley. Now, this isn't that 40 to 50% of all jobs will go. This is just that within 15 years, artificial intelligence and the automated software, they will be capable of doing 40 to 50% of all jobs that exist right now. And these images here are some of the jobs that are under threat. So if you've got, a teenager in your house who wants to be a radiologist, tell them to pick something else, because there aren't going to be many radiologists around 10, 15 years from now. So if there's 1 million around now, there'll probably be less than 100,000 around in 10 to 15 years, because the artificial intelligence already detects cancer and all these things much better than human beings do. And they're just not going to need a lot of humans to do this job anymore. So we're not just talking about blue collar jobs, as you can see there, paralegals, accountants, stock market analysts. All of these jobs are going to be severely reduced or just go away because automated software is going to take care of all of this, particularly these driving jobs. They're really going to be hit hard. When you call an Uber 10 years from now, you're going to get this car that, you know, there's no one in there. You know, so all these people are relying on truck driving and moving things around like that. A lot of those jobs are going to go. And I know in a lot of US states, driving jobs is one of the top jobs for men. And right now, there are no answers. No one in government is planning for the technological mass unemployment that is definitely coming. Amazon has already closed 30% of American stores and malls. And we've seen the same thing here with these big high street closures. It's because a lot of the shopping now happens online. So there's less humans needed for the job. So these stores are all closing down. So you've seen this already. You go into McDonald's, kiosks. This robot is already working in California, serving 120 cups of coffee an hour, and not just standard cups of coffee, all different kinds of cups of coffee. Doesn't take a bathroom break, no COVID isolation, doesn't, you know, go on holiday or anything like that. Never calls in sick, just works. This machine here could make gourmet hamburgers, not your McDonald's hamburger now, but gourmet hamburgers, 400 in an hour. This machine exists now and is already at work in some US states. I remember there was going to be some kind of strike action in some McDonald's areas in the United States, and the leadership threatened them, say, look, there's already all kinds of technology that can do your jobs. If you want to strike, strike. We could just replace you with the technology. And here in England, the British Retail Consortium estimates that over the next 20 years, 60% of jobs in retail will be at risk due to automation. So I took this quote from the 2017 study that we saw. So there are going to be differences across parts of our society in how this technological mass unemployment hits each group. So if you look at whites, their unemployment rate at the time, you know, they did the study was 3.7%. For women in general, 4.3%. Young people, so this is like 16 to 24-year-olds, 14.7%. And for young Black Americans, it was 25.9%. But for male African Americans, they were at that time already at 33%, the young ones. Now, when you add in technological unemployment, and they take the lowest workforce impact, so this is where they're looking at maybe 14% of the jobs going, and the projections are for much more than 14%. I would say if you want to see something that's probably likely going to happen, you should at least look at numbers around 25 to 30%, but they went with the low number. Just going with the low number, the workforce was going to be negatively affected by technology. So when you just add on the current level, you quickly end up with a situation where young Black men are likely to have a 50% unemployment rate. And that's just with 14% of the workforce being negatively affected by technological unemployment. And I think it's going to be double that. But look at that number there, 50% of young Black men will be unemployed if this hits and the government or the community doesn't have a plan for it. And this study was from 2018. Now, if we look at the United Kingdom with youth unemployment, so this is from 2009, right after the financial crisis. So you see white was at 20%, Asian 31%, Black people 48%. So we were more than twice as high for young Black people. We move on to 2017, we saw that Black men consistently have the lowest employment rates, and this was amongst graduates. So university graduates, they were 2 or 3 times more likely to be unemployed, even with that degree. And when we move it to 2018, 2019, again, for young Black people, 16 to 24, we saw double the rate of unemployment. And then since COVID, the UK jobless rate for young Black people rose by more than a third to 35%. And this was at the same time where it was just 13% for white people, young white people, and 24% for young Asian people. So the pattern here over the, the past 12 years is pretty clear. When you have, this unemployment hitting, communities, it hits them differently. So when this technological unemployment hits, it's going to hit Black people the hardest out of any group. I mean, look at where it is. So COVID is, like a big problem, right? But look at how it hit groups differently. 35% for young Black people. Now this, I do a lot of work around knife crime. So inequality is one of the big factors around knife crime. So if we mix this information with what I talked about regarding causes of young men behaving in this risky, violent, competitive manner, the conditions that cause that, technological unemployment is going to increase those conditions drastically. Inequality intensifies competitive behavior, leading to higher levels of violent criminality, especially amongst lower status males. And this technological unemployment will then move more of us into this slide that you should remember. I showed it maybe in the second lecture. So these are the effects of deprivation on human behavior. So because they're environments that are much more unpredictable and harsh, they're less well-resourced, mortality rates are higher, educational outcomes are poorer, and antisocial behavior is much higher in them. So this is also a slide we've seen before, where you have group A that are living in deprivation and group B, they're in much better environment, more predictable, stable. So if you look at group A, this is the tendency for what it causes for people living in deprivation. Now, if we match that with those figures we just saw, a larger percentage of our population is already in deprivation. And with what's coming over the next 10 to 15 years, more of our population will end up here in deprivation if we don't have a plan. And you look at the behaviors it brings out of populations there, the tendency for it, it's already bad enough. We can't have more of our population ending up in deprivation relative to other groups. So this is also a slide you should remember from before. So the middle map, the blue one, is where the concentration of the Afro-Caribbean population is in. The one on your left shows the orange-yellow areas. That's the concentration of deprivation. And then the red one shows where knife crime is concentrated. And as you can see, all those areas, they overlap. And so this is how these behaviors show up more in the areas of deprivation. Excuse me. And we are overrepresented in deprived areas, and the inequality that this represents is a massive factor in the violent criminality that we see. So when you reduce those mainstream opportunities, which technological mass unemployment will do, young men are still going to want respect, status, and personal advancement, and people will find other ways to pursue it. And when you can't get it legitimately, you're going to do it illegitimately, and this is going to be with the illegal criminal behaviors, and then this tends to cause more competitive and violence as they compete for the resources that they're getting illegitimately and in a criminal manner. So how do demographics predict future politics? So this 2014 study I found very informative, because what they did is they showed different groups the demographic data, but one group got the additional information that even though whites will become a minority, less than 50% in some of these Western nations, in America very quickly, but certainly not in England now, but down the road, if it continues, that will happen here too. But what they showed them is that even though you'll be the minority, you'll still be socially dominant. And that was the key, because once they found out, okay, we are going to be a smaller population, but we will still be socially dominant, then they were okay with demographic change. It wasn't a problem as long as they knew they were going to remain at the top of the heap. So as long as whites stay on top, they don't need to employ the services of these bully fascist type leaders. But if they're afraid, that's when they want guys like that. So this gives us predictive power of what demographic change will do, because most of them do feel that they will lose political power and their place in society. So anything that indicates, to whites, they're losing that top status, it's going to cause higher levels of these types of behaviors that we're seeing now. And this is not cultural, political, this is a product of our species typical behavior, our tribal status psychology that all humans have. So I'd like to finish this paraphrasing my favorite author, because this behavior pattern that they're displaying because of demographic change, many of them are serving, taking pride in, or in denial about where this challenge to white status, racial respect, and dominance are taking our world. And that is like ignoring cancer. As once again, so many of them simply do not realize what a dangerous thing it is that they are doing.
Thank you, Mr. Grandison. And remind me the name of the lady who you're citing.
Octavia Butler.
Okay. That's a name that's new to me, and I shall be on Amazon purchasing her books straight after this lecture. Thank you for your research, time, and such a fantastic delivery as well. We have 8 minutes for Q&A. And I want to just give you guys the opportunity just to share or ask any final thoughts before we wrap up and say goodnight. I'm going to start with Jamaica. Hand up straight away.
Oh yeah. Hi. I just want to ask a question about the bots, like the robots and the bots. Like, how sustainable is that for society overall? If the bots are doing majority of the work, who's going to be able to? If no one has a job, like 50% of the population don't have jobs, or 47%, who's going to be able to buy the products? I mean, doesn't that have an overall negative effect on that particular country, that society? I know for my job, I'm a budget analyst, and they are going full force with bots. It is making our job easier. I'm not sure exactly, when it will go to the point of, replacing human beings. It would make sense for like a country to say, okay, well, if we only go from 10 people to 5 because of bots or the robots, then maybe have those 5 people jobs split up among, like go from an 8-hour day to a 3-hour day per person, to make sure your citizens still have gainful employment, or give out money like they do in Alaska, or how they said Dr. King or that Andrew Yang was talking about giving everybody $1,000 a month. It just seems kind of crazy if you're gonna, disemploy all these people, and then who's going to be able to buy anything?
Right.
Yeah.
So this is the dilemma. And then you're right. And I read that book, by Andrew Yang, and I've listened to what the Silicon Valley people are saying. They're all talking universal basic income, because there's no stopping the technology. It's definitely coming. The politicians are dumb. They are not planning for any of this at all. They are reactive. They are not proactive. So the technologists know what's coming. That's why they're already saying, look, you need to prepare for this because this is coming. But I haven't really, you mentioned Alaska, and I think they did have a UBI up there. I think they give money from the oil over there to the people. And I think a Scandinavian country has actually trialed a universal basic income for like certain cities in their countries. But there isn't a lot of preparation going on for this, even though it's all coming and kind of is coming already. And I'm saying we can't wait for the politicians. We need to have our own plan, because this is going to hit us harder than it hits anyone else. Because we're like, last hired, first fired. And then with the consequences of inequality causing more disruption to our families, our communities, with the violence with our young men, and then the criminal justice system is going to be waiting there to just harvest and over police as less, young Black people are employed. It's a setup, and we have to be prepared for it.
Mm. Thank you, Jamaica. We're going to go to Freddie.
Hi, Christopher. Thanks for another very informative presentation. But just in response to your last comment about the plan, are you aware of any African-based groups who are planning for this, for the eventuality that you've just been describing?
The technological unemployment?
Just that, plus the increasing, I suppose, fear of losing their hierarchical place, and the impact that's having on, I suppose, immigrant populations in the West in general. Because it's, you know, it's kind of, I suppose, it's all part of the same problem. And what would seem logical would be for more collective planning or collectivism amongst the African communities in those places, but that historically hasn't been a strong point. So just wondering whether there are some remedies or there are some efforts going on that are trying to kind of address the issues that might be coming along. Thank you.
I haven't seen much in terms of preparation for what's coming, in terms of what I've talked about. Certainly not with the technological mass unemployment. I haven't seen anyone in our community really talking about it. That doesn't mean they're not. I just may not be aware of them. Actually, Nigel may be more aware of what other groups are doing in terms of whether the community or on a national level or whatever. I haven't seen it myself, no. What do you think, Nigel?
I think more people are just returning to nature, basically. They're basically divesting from the social contract and doing like the maroon communities, living off land, setting up new, I guess, colonies where they can live as much as they can off the earth without being caught up in the capitalist web. And I know a lot of people who are doing that. They literally just had enough of being on the Ferris wheel, that they're repatriating, finding land and living like we did before this all started.
Okay, yeah. It's actually going to be a really big problem, because if you look in America, they have more guns than people. So when, you know, because everyone's going to get hit by this, it's not going to be, you know, just what it's, all groups will be hit. It will just be at different levels. But, you know, America's got a violence problem right now. But when you crank up this mass unemployment, and if they don't come in with the universal basic income, and certainly the Republicans and people on the right are not going to support that, America's going to look like a peaceful place now compared to where it can end up if they don't find a way to handle this problem before it gets out of hand.
Yeah, I think it will force a rethink in our economic system, 100%, and we might be benefactors of that. I can see UBI coming in 100%, but you know, with the lust and thirst that this system creates for goods and services, and that being out of reach of populations and being at the bottom of hierarchies and statuses, then I can see this carnage and Armageddon like you. So, but I'm not too far in age from you, so I think I'll be dead and gone too. So, going to is it Shai or Chi? Which one?
Yeah, it's Chi, actually.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. I just want to say that actually, like I do communications and PR, and I was actually working for an artificial intelligence research institute for 18 months, and working quite closely with the researchers who are kind of in the process of, you know, developing these new technologies. And yeah, I mean, you know, and like for me, that was like very kind of much of an eye-opener. One issue that was very striking was how few Black people there were who are actually engaged in the research as scientists. So out of about 400 researchers, there was only one Black scientist who I never actually got to meet because he was like based in Cambridge. But, you know, that kind of representation within this field is also really, really important because it's a field that is dominated by young white males. and also increasingly South Asians and East Asians. And because they have the power, the knowledge and the skills and the education, so it means that they influence the direction of the technologies, and the rest of us are just kind of held to ransom. So what we are experiencing is just their kind of worldview and the power that they have to implement it. And there is the issue of unemployment, but the thing that's even more sinister is the use of AI in the criminal justice system. So, for example, West Midlands Police at the moment are running a pilot around predictive policing, where they're trying to see if they can predict crime before it actually happens. And then that's like a process of mass surveillance and capturing data around that. And of course, they kind of fall back on the stereotypes. So it means like much more surveillance for Black communities. And it's the same in the States with the criminal justice system. They're using algorithms for sentencing, and that's also using data which already traditionally penalizes Black communities and Black males, especially by giving them higher sentences. So I think there's, you know, the AI thing, there's like the employment issue, but there's also the very kind of violent side of it as well, which is just going to generate more injustice and more brutality in the Black community, because as well as the violence intensifies because of the disillusion, then they will just kind of develop technologies that match that violence. So instead of using humans, actual policemen, they will just develop robots. And robots that are faster, robots that are kind of more powerful, that will use more force, and you know, and that's the plan on how to kind of manage these issues in the future. So I think, yeah, I think there's a lot for us to think about as a Black community in relation to that. And I'm sorry to go on, it's just an issue that's quite close to me because I'm also involved in a campaign against lethal autonomous weapons, which is basically using AI to power weapons without any human control whatsoever. And you know that those are going to be used in developing countries predominantly. So yeah, it's a scary landscape out there.
It is a scary landscape, and sorry to end the lecture on such a somber note. Appreciate your inputs there, Chi. I'm gonna give Chris the opportunity to answer this question next week when the lecture is all about Afro futures, and what are some of the solutions that we can look at? What are the ways that we can put our heads together, use our intellectual material to build collective action and a new politics. I'm looking forward to that lecture, not least because it's the last one of the series, which will be sad. But yes, for now, we're over time, and I want to thank you for listening. Thank Chris for another wonderful lecture. And please, please turn up on the 19th, because then we will hopefully end on some ideas and solutions that we can take forward and use to implement in our own spheres of influence and communities.